In every empire, there are men who work in the shadows, men who do not carry guns, yet hold in their hands the power to reshape nations. I was one of those men. My title sounded harmless enough, economic consultant. My mission, however, was far from innocent. I was trained to persuade, to manipulate, and to ensnare entire countries into a web of debt so tight they could never escape. And all of it was done under the noble banner of economic development. This is the story of how global power truly operates, not through armies alone, but through loans, projections, promises, and the polished language of international finance. Behind the smiling faces of corporate executives and government envoys lies a silent machinery designed to create dependence, extract resources, and ensure that wealth flows in one direction only. The words ahead revealed the world as I lived it, a realm where contracts can be deadlier than bullets, where aid becomes a disguise for domination, and where the fate of a nation can be rewritten in a conference room thousands of miles away. You are about to step into that world. Stay with this summary. Let it take you beneath the surface of global economics, into the mechanics of influence, the architecture of modern empire, and the personal confessions of a man who helped build it. Chapter 1. An economic hitman is born. I never intended to become part of an empire. Like many young men searching for purpose, I imagined my life might follow the familiar trails of business or diplomacy. Yet fate, guided by a mix of coincidence, ambition, and subtle manipulation, had other plans. My entry into the world of global influence began innocently enough, wrapped in the charm of recruiters who spoke about opportunity, adventure, and serving humanity. What they did not say was far more important than what they did. The first seeds were planted during my time at business school, where I learned the language of economics, growth rates, development indexes, projections, and feasibility studies. These were not mere academic concepts. Later, they would become weapons, tools crafted to shape the destinies of nations. And then came the interviews, quiet rooms, polite smiles, questions that probed deeper than any corporate conversation should. Only later did I understand that these were evaluations of obedience, ambition, and susceptibility. Eventually, I was approached by a woman named Claudine, charismatic, intelligent, almost hypnotic in her ability to make the extraordinary sound perfectly normal. She spoke plainly about the role I was being considered for, a role that needed men who could blend numbers with persuasion, who could cloak control in goodwill. It was she who uttered the words that changed my life. You will help make the world better, but you must learn to see it differently. Under her guidance, I discovered that my job would not be to build nations, but to bind them. I would travel to developing countries, offer them visions of immense wealth through infrastructure projects, and persuade their leaders to accept loans so colossal they could never repay them. The debt would ensure loyalty, the contracts would enrich American corporations, and the subtle pressure would secure strategic access to resources like oil. Every empire has its foot soldiers. I had become one of them. Yet at the beginning, I didn't see the manipulation. I saw only the adventure, the promise of significance, the illusion of service, and the intoxicating belief that I was part of something grand. Only later would the truth unravel, thread by uncomfortable thread. Stepping into this world was stepping into a moral maze, one where intentions could be painted however convenient and outcomes could always be justified. And so the transformation began, slowly and almost imperceptibly, the making of an economic hitman. The story deepens from here, moving into boardrooms in Boston, presidential palaces in Latin America, and hidden deals shaped behind diplomatic smiles, revealing a system carefully engineered to reshape the modern world.
Chapter 2. The First Assignments. The early days of my new career felt like stepping into a hidden chamber of global power, a room where the walls were lined with maps, economic charts, and agendas far too ambitious to ever be spoken aloud in any public forum. My company, Maine, didn't describe itself as a tool of influence. It described itself as a consulting firm, a developer of nations, a partner in progress. Yet beneath that polished exterior lay the true machinery of empire. My introduction to real fieldwork came quickly. I was sent to Ecuador, a country woven with deep forests, oil-rich lands, and communities struggling between tradition and promises of modernity. On paper, the mission was simple: forecast massive economic growth to support a loan that would finance new infrastructure, bridges, power plants, roads, symbols of advancement. But symbols can be deceptive. The task given to me was not to calculate honest projections. It was to create numbers that served a purpose, to convince Ecuador that it needed billions in loans it could never hope to repay. The country's leaders were eager for modernization. They wanted to lift their people from poverty. They also wanted to believe the forecasts I was constructing. And that belief was the opening we needed. I met with ministers, engineers, policy advisors, each with their own dreams for the nation. Their hopes became the very material I would use to bind them into commitments. When I presented the charts, they sparkled with optimism. Rising GDP curves, booming energy demand, exponential increases in productivity. These predictions were designed to dazzle, to drown out doubts, to make enormous debt feel not like a burden, but a doorway to prosperity. But the reality lurking behind the paper was far more calculated. The loans would return immediately to the pockets of American corporations, construction giants, engineering firms, suppliers of heavy equipment. Ecuador would be left with the bill. And once the bill grew too large, the country would become pliable, open to negotiations that served U.S. political and commercial interests. During those first months, I struggled to reconcile the contradictions. I told myself I was helping, bringing electricity to villages, modern roads to cities, hospitals and schools to communities that deserved them. Yet a quiet unease always followed me, whispering from behind the spreadsheets. You are not helping a nation rise. You are positioning it to kneel. Still, the system worked smoothly, almost elegantly. Everyone involved played their part. I crafted projections, government officials signed agreements, corporations celebrated contracts, and somewhere in the background, the gears of geopolitics continued turning. My work had begun in earnest, and with it came a deeper initiation into the unspoken rules of the profession. Numbers were never neutral. Development was never just development, and every loan carried a hidden price. I was beginning to see the shape of my role, even if I wasn't ready to face its consequences. The next chapters would take me further into this labyrinth, into Panama, Saudi Arabia, and the Andean highlands, where the stakes were higher, the deals more complex, and the moral compromises harder to ignore.
Chapter 3. Panama and the Man Who Wouldn't Bow. Panama arrived in my life like a sudden jolt. Humid air, restless streets, and a narrow strip of land whose importance far outweighed its size. The canal was more than a waterway. It was an artery of global power. Whoever controlled it controlled the flow of world commerce. That reality shaped everything in Panama, its politics, its people, and ultimately, my mission. From the moment I landed, it was clear that this assignment was different. Ecuador had been a negotiation shaped by optimism and economic dreams. Panama was a confrontation with geopolitics in its rawest form. And at the center of it all stood one man, General Omar Torrijos. Torrijos was unlike any leader I had encountered. He possessed a charisma that felt carved from experience, dignity, and a stubborn refusal to be owned by anyone. He believed fiercely in the sovereignty of his nation and in securing a fair treaty that would return the Panama Canal to Panamanian control. That alone made him a problem, a leader who couldn't be bought, bribed, or flattered into compliance. I was sent in as part of a familiar strategy, offered development, loans, and dazzling forecasts. Present a vision where Panama would flourish under the right partnerships, ours, of course. The underlying message was subtle, but unmistakable. Cooperate with us economically, and political negotiations will flow more smoothly. But Torrijos was not fooled. In meetings, he listened with polite patience, yet his eyes said he had already calculated the angles. When I spoke about projected growth, increased infrastructure, and the economic models I had prepared, he nodded. Then he asked questions that sliced through the presentations like a knife. What happens when the debt rises beyond our capacity? Who truly benefits from these contracts? Are we partners or are we tenants in our own home? He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Truth carries its own volume. Unlike other leaders who welcomed our proposals with gratitude or ambition, Torrijos treated them with suspicion. He believed in progress, but not at the cost of Panama's independence. And because he could not be enticed into the cycle of debt, he became an obstacle in a game where obstacles were rarely tolerated for long. My role shifted from persuasion to observation. I could sense the tension building around him. Conversations in hallways, quiet warnings from colleagues, subtle reminders that the United States had many tools at its disposal. There was a hierarchy to power, and Torrijos was refusing to stand where he was expected. During this period, I began to feel the fracture widening inside me. The work I performed was no longer cushioned by self-deception. Torrijos made the consequences visible. He spoke for his people, not for his own pockets. He saw through the facade of economic development and named it for what it was: control disguised as opportunity. And the more time I spent around him, the clearer it became that the men who resisted, genuinely resisted, rarely ended well. Panama was not just another assignment. It marked the moment when I started to understand the true stakes. Nations were not merely being shaped, they were being steered. Leaders were not partners, they were pawns, or targets. And in the shadows of political maneuvering, I began hearing hints and murmurs, rumors of what happens when a leader stands too tall, too firm, too independent. Those murmurs would soon grow louder as I was sent further into the world, into projects designed to reshape entire regions. But the memory of Panama and of Torrijos stayed with me, a reminder of the rare courage it takes to confront an empire. More of the labyrinth awaited in the next chapter. Chapter 4: Saudi Arabia, the Kingdom of Grand Designs. Saudi Arabia was a world apart, vast, shimmering under a heat that felt ancient, wealthy beyond imagination, yet standing on the brink of transformation. When I arrived, the kingdom was preparing for a new era. Oil revenues had flooded its coffers, and the ruling elite envisioned a future in which the nation's infrastructure would rival the great capitals of the West. Roads, airports, desalination plants, industrial cities, visions as sweeping as the deserts surrounding them. For men like me, this was the ultimate playground. Unlike Ecuador or Panama, Saudi Arabia didn't need loans. That was the puzzle. Without debt, there was no leverage. Without leverage, there was no hold. But Washington and major corporations didn't intend to let the kingdom drift outside their orbit. They needed a different approach, one that would anchor Saudi Arabia's wealth to American interests for decades. That approach took the form of the Saudi Arabian money laundering affair, though of course no one dared call it that. Publicly, it was an agreement between the kingdom and the United States. Saudi Arabia would invest its oil profits in U.S. Treasury bonds, and in return, the interest earned would fund massive development projects built almost exclusively by American firms. It was a brilliant mechanism. The Saudis would appear to be investing wisely and modernizing their nation. The U.S. would quietly reclaim the money, use it to stabilize its own economy, and funnel it back into American corporations. And my role was to justify it all with economic projections so optimistic they bordered on fiction. The meetings in Riyadh held a surreal quality. On one side of the table sat carefully robed Saudi princes and ministers, men steeped in tradition, hospitality, and a sense of destiny. On the other side sat American engineers, executives, and specialists, ambassadors of Western capitalism. My job was to bridge these worlds, to make the numbers sing loudly enough that skepticism would be drowned out in the chorus. I spoke of population growth, industrial expansion, rising demand for energy, soaring GDP. I painted Saudi Arabia's future in broad strokes, an economic renaissance powered by American expertise. And it worked. The bolder the promises, the more captivated the officials became. After all, they wanted the vision to be true. They wanted to see the kingdom transformed in their lifetimes. Behind the scenes, the U.S. government watched closely. Saudi oil was the bloodstream of global stability. The kingdom's allegiance, or even partial independence, could shake the world. By tying their finances to Washington, America secured not only economic influence, but political loyalty. As for me, the rewards were immense. I stayed in luxurious hotels, attended lavish dinners, and witnessed negotiations shaped by petrodollars and ambition. Yet beneath the glittering surface, I felt the moral ground shifting further beneath my feet. I was helping construct an empire made not of soldiers, but of spreadsheets, not of invasions, but of contracts. The method was subtle, almost elegant, and yet the consequences were enormous. Entire nations were being drawn into a system that promised prosperity, but delivered dependence. In many moments, I told myself I was only a small cog in a massive machine. But even a small cog can turn heavier wheels. Saudi Arabia was the grandest stage of my career, a place where power didn't hide, it glowed. And while the project succeeded beyond expectation, its success carried a troubling truth. When wealth becomes a tether, sovereignty becomes negotiable. Ahead of me lay more assignments, more illusions to craft, more nations to entangle. But Saudi Arabia remained a turning point, a realization that the tactics we used were not accidents of opportunity, but deliberate tools of an empire skilled at shaping the world in its image. And the machinery once set in motion was not designed to stop. Chapter 5. The Quiet Architecture of Empire. By the time I returned from Saudi Arabia, the architecture of the game had become clear. There was nothing accidental or chaotic about the system I was serving. It was a machine engineered with precision, an empire built without armies, without colonies, without the crude bluntness of conquest. Its weapons were contracts, its battlegrounds were boardrooms, and its soldiers were people like me. I had been taught to think of myself as an economist, but I had become something else entirely, a craftsman of indebted futures. My work wasn't about understanding a country's needs, it was about reshaping its destiny, sometimes gently, sometimes ruthlessly. The tools we used were elegant in their simplicity. We found nations rich in resources or strategically vital. We offered them loans tied to promises of progress. We produced forecasts drenched in optimism. We handed them blueprints for dams, power grids, highways. We assured them these projects were the key to prosperity. And beneath every one of those steps lay a quiet intention: bind them. Once the contracts were signed, the cycle became predictable. The money flowed out of the World Bank or U.S. Treasury and returned immediately to American corporations. The nation receiving the loan saw new infrastructure, yes, but the profits remained elsewhere. And the debt stayed, growing heavier year by year. A country in debt is a country within reach. When payments became overwhelming, and they always did, we returned with solutions. Sell us oil at a discount. Allow our companies access to your resources. Support our positions at the United Nations. Permit our military bases on your soil. It was empire without flags. Yet even within this well-oiled system, cracks appeared. Leaders who resisted, communities who questioned, economists who refused to falsify projections. But the machine was prepared for resistance. It had layers: first persuasion, then pressure, and if both failed, darker tools waited in the shadows. I began to see how nations weren't simply being influenced, they were being rewritten. Their histories bent to align with economic models invented in corporate boardrooms. Their futures shaped around interests that weren't their own. And somewhere within this web, I could feel the slow erosion of my own illusions. I had once believed I was part of a mission to uplift the world. Now I was beginning to recognize the truth. I was part of the design meant to preserve the dominance of a few by steering the destinies of many. The people living in these developing nations, the farmers in the Andes, the fishermen along the Gulf of Panama, the families in Middle Eastern villages, they weren't numbers on a page. They were the ones who bore the weight of our strategies, who paid for our ambitions with their future. This realization didn't arrive like lightning strike. It settled over me gradually, a slow tightening around the conscience. But once it settled, it changed the way I viewed every assignment. I was no longer just shaping projections. I was participating in something vast, intricate, and morally corrosive. The empire had many faces: diplomatic, financial, corporate, and behind each face was a single drive: control. And for those who stood outside its designs, the consequences could be fatal. Panama had shown me a glimpse of that truth. Soon, I would witness it again with far more devastating clarity. The next chapter would lead me into the darker edges of resistance and the lengths the system would go to silence those who refused to kneel.
Chapter 6: The Silence That Follows Resistance. The deeper I moved into this world, the more I understood that resistance, true resistance, was not tolerated. The empire I served did not rely on military invasion, it relied on compliance. And when compliance failed, consequences followed with a cold, quiet efficiency. Panama became the first place where this truth struck with undeniable force. General Omar Torrijos had stood his ground. He refused to let his country drown in engineered debt. He refused to hand over land, rights, or autonomy in exchange for promises dressed as development. He spoke openly about the games being played, naming them with a clarity that unsettled those who preferred their influence unspoken. And so Torrijos became a problem the system needed to resolve. I wasn't in Panama the day his aircraft went down. I learned the news the way the world did, through headlines that spoke of tragedy, of malfunction, of misfortune. But no one I worked with believed the narrative printed in the newspapers. The atmosphere within the circles I moved in was heavy, subdued, and unmistakably knowing. There are accidents, and then there are messages. Torrijos wasn't the first leader to refuse the economic noose, and he wouldn't be the last, but he was the first whose death felt personal to me. His courage had reflected my own compromises so sharply that when the news broke, it was as if a mirror had shattered. I remembered our conversations, his directness, his distrust of the illusions I presented, his insistence that Panama's dignity was not for sale. His refusal was not loud or dramatic, it had simply been firm. And firmness in the face of empire was often treated as defiance. Another leader, Ecuador's Jaime Raldós, would soon meet a similar fate. He too resisted. He too insisted on sovereignty. And he too died in a suspicious plane crash after standing against the policies we were sent to enforce. These patterns were not coincidences, they were instructions. Speak softly, sign quickly, or your story ends abruptly. As these events unfolded, something within me shifted irreversibly. The system I once defended with rationalizations, development, modernization, efficiency, revealed itself in its truest form, a structure that protected power at any cost. It didn't matter if roads were built or hospitals opened. What mattered was control. The projects were the bait, the hook was the debt. I still performed my role. I still attended meetings, crafted forecasts, and presented polished visions, but I could no longer pretend that the work was benign. I carried with me the weight of Torrijos's voice, the memory of Raldós's integrity, the realization that beneath the surface of economic diplomacy lay the threat of something far darker. This was the empire's shadow, the part no one discussed in reports or conferences, the part that whispered, comply or disappear. And as I continued my journey through countries, ministries, and negotiations, the shadow followed me. It lingered at the edge of every new assignment, reminding me of the cost of defiance, not just for nations, but for individuals brave enough to stand alone. In the chapters ahead, my own internal conflict would deepen. I was becoming both insider and witness, both participant and reluctant observer of a machinery that devoured those who stood in its path. The world outside saw development. I was beginning to see the casualties. The deeper I sank into the work, the clearer it became that the numbers we produced were not analytical errors or optimistic forecasts. They were weapons. Nations did not borrow because they needed to grow. They borrowed because we convinced them that refusing meant isolation. We spoke of development as though it were a sacred right, but our real purpose was to forge a chain of obligations so heavy that no country could lift it alone. When debts inevitably spiraled beyond what any reasonable economy could sustain, we returned not as partners, but as creditors with terms. We demanded access to natural resources, military cooperation, UN votes, or the privatization of national infrastructure. These agreements rarely appeared on official documents. They were conveyed in conversations behind closed doors, over dinners framed as diplomatic courtesies. The agreements that followed bore the signatures of presidents and ministers, but I learned to see them for what they were: contracts drafted under duress, sealed with invisible ink.
Some leaders resisted. They questioned the forecasts, challenged the assumptions, or refused to burden generations of citizens with impossible loans. Their resistance, however, placed them on a different kind of list, one maintained not by economists, but by those who operated in the shadows. The euphemism was stabilization, but the effect was unmistakable. A plane crash here, a sudden coup there, a medical emergency that arrived too precisely to be natural. When persuasion failed, darker hands intervened. I lived between these worlds, one of polished offices, tailored suits, and official reports, and another where whispers carried the weight of threats. The conflict wore on me. Each trip abroad, each negotiation felt like a rehearsal in moral evasion. Yet the rewards were designed to soothe conscience: generous pay, promotions, praise from those whose approval seemed to define success. It took time to understand that such approval was a kind of currency used to buy silence. What unsettled me most was realizing how ordinary the system appeared from within. No grand conspiracies, no villains stroking cats in underground lairs, just institutions following incentives, professionals doing their jobs, and a structure calibrated to convert global inequality into profit. The machinery of empire rarely announces itself. It functions precisely because it looks like legitimate business. But once you see it, once you recognize the patterns, you can't look away. The world map changes shape. Countries cease to be distant abstractions and become case studies in extraction, painted in shades of dependence. And I, for better or worse, had helped draw those lines. Chapter 7: Debt and Influence. As the story unfolds, Perkins dives deeper into the mechanisms of economic control that define the life of an economic hitman. He explains that nations are ensnared in debt under the guise of development loans, often sourced from international banks and sanctioned by powerful governments. These loans are presented as a path to modernization, funding infrastructure projects, schools, and hospitals, but in reality, they bind countries to foreign influence. The debt is structured to ensure that the borrowing nations cannot repay without adhering to the agendas of the lenders. Perkins shares first-hand accounts of negotiations with government officials, highlighting the subtle yet insidious ways pressure is applied. Promises of prosperity are coupled with veiled threats. If the country refuses to comply with the lender's directives, the flow of money stops, projects stall, and economic instability looms. He describes this system not as a conspiracy theory, but as a carefully orchestrated strategy to expand corporate and political influence under the veneer of economic development. The chapter emphasizes the human cost of these practices. Ordinary citizens bear the brunt of austerity measures, inflation, and unemployment that follow when countries are forced to prioritize debt repayment over social welfare. Perkins recounts moments of moral conflict, noting the stark contrast between the rhetoric of progress and the lived reality of the people in these nations. Infrastructure may rise, but it often serves the interests of the global elite rather than the populace. Perkins also reflects on his own complicity and evolving awareness. He began to recognize the structural violence embedded in the global economic system, where loans, contracts, and economic policy are instruments of control. The chapter serves as both a personal narrative and a broader critique, revealing the hidden mechanisms by which nations are subtly coerced into compliance, effectively trading sovereignty for the promise of development. Chapter 8: The Tools of Coercion. In this chapter, Perkins explores the full spectrum of tools used to maintain economic control over nations. Beyond loans and financial manipulation, he highlights the subtle coercion embedded in trade agreements, international aid, and political pressure. Nations are offered the appearance of opportunity and partnership, yet these arrangements often serve the strategic interests of multinational corporations and powerful governments, rather than the local populace. Perkins details how economic and political consultants, advisors, and even engineers, roles he himself occupied, act as intermediaries. Their task is to convince leaders that compliance is in their national interest, masking the reality of external domination. Infrastructure projects, energy development, and industrial loans are presented as modernizing forces, yet they carry hidden conditions designed to tie the country's economy to global powers, creating dependency and limiting sovereignty. The chapter emphasizes the psychological and moral dimensions of this work. Perkins describes the tension between professional duty and ethical awareness. On one hand, projects appear to promise progress. On the other, they are mechanisms of control that subvert democratic decision-making and prioritize foreign profit over local welfare. He recounts encounters with government officials who, under pressure, make concessions that compromise national priorities, illustrating the delicate interplay of persuasion, intimidation, and economic leverage. Perkins also addresses the long-term consequences of this coercion. Debt compounds, social programs are cut, and infrastructure often benefits foreign contractors more than citizens. Nations may outwardly appear prosperous with towering buildings and roads, but the population frequently bears the hidden costs in poverty, unemployment, and lost autonomy. Through vivid examples, Perkins portrays the hidden machinery of economic subjugation, showing how policy, finance, and influence combine to maintain a system that few outside the inner circles fully understand. The chapter closes with a reflective tone, highlighting Perkins' growing awareness of the moral complexity and systemic injustice inherent in his work. He begins to see the cumulative impact of economic manipulation on global inequality and recognizes the need to expose and challenge these practices for the sake of justice and human dignity. Chapter 9. The Turning Point. In this chapter, Perkins reflects on a crucial turning point in his career and personal awareness. After years of facilitating economic manipulation and witnessing its human cost, he begins to confront the ethical implications of his work. He describes the growing dissonance between professional success and personal conscience, realizing that the prosperity promised to nations was often illusory, leaving ordinary citizens burdened by debt, inequality, and dependency. Perkins recounts specific examples where his advice and actions directly benefited multinational corporations at the expense of local populations. He describes the internal struggle of understanding the breadth of these consequences while navigating the expectations of his employers and clients. The chapter delves into the complexity of systemic economic control. Perkins explains how debt, loans, and international agreements are not isolated tools, but part of an integrated strategy that ensures long-term influence and compliance. Even well-intentioned leaders find themselves caught in this intricate web, often forced to make compromises that undermine national autonomy and social welfare. Perkins' narrative becomes more introspective, focusing on the moral awakening that drives him toward eventual disclosure. He reflects on the importance of understanding the structural inequalities embedded in global finance, recognizing that these patterns are not accidental but deliberately maintained by those in positions of power. The chapter emphasizes the tension between complicity and conscience, setting the stage for the eventual decision to reveal these practices to the public. By the end of Chapter 9, Perkins is increasingly determined to expose the mechanisms of economic coercion, not only to alleviate his personal guilt, but also to inform and empower others to recognize and challenge the hidden forces shaping global economies.
Chapter 10: Confessions and Consequences. In this final chapter, Perkins lays bare the full scope of his experiences as an economic hitman and reflects on the consequences of the system he once served. He recounts the cumulative impact of decades of economic manipulation, how nations were ensnared in debt, leaders coerced, and populations left struggling under the weight of external influence. The narrative is deeply personal, blending memoir with a broader critique of global economic structures. Perkins emphasizes that the tools of control, loans, aid packages, contracts, and infrastructure projects were designed to create dependency, ensuring that countries complied with the agendas of powerful corporations and governments. He describes how the promises of prosperity were often hollow, leaving nations superficially modernized but fundamentally beholden to foreign interests. The chapter also explores Perkins' moral reckoning. He reflects on his complicity and the ethical dilemmas he faced, revealing the personal cost of participating in a system that prioritizes profit and power over human welfare. This introspection highlights the tension between professional obligation and conscience, illustrating how awareness and courage can lead to transformative action. Perkins concludes with a call to awareness and action, urging readers to recognize the mechanisms of economic coercion and the influence of global financial powers. He stresses that knowledge is the first step toward change. By understanding the strategies used to manipulate nations, individuals, leaders, and citizens can advocate for greater transparency, accountability, and fairness in global finance. John Perkins' Confessions of an Economic Hitman exposes the hidden forces shaping our world. From the manipulation of national debt to the coercion of leaders, this book reveals the mechanisms through which economic power is wielded, often at the expense of ordinary citizens. It is a wake-up call to understand and challenge the structures of global influence.